Hi, my name is John Forkey. I'll be presenting on leprosy, scientific name Hansen's disease. So first, we're just going to get into some of the characteristics of Mycobacterium leprae, which is the bacteria that causes leprosy. So it is a microaerophile. It's an obligate intracellular pathogen, which is pretty interesting. Basically, it's lost the genes necessary to sustain life outside of a host, and so you can't grow it on a medium, and studying in that way makes it actually pretty difficult to study. And then it's an acid-fast bacteria, bacillus-shaped. It has a waxy outer coating, which will be important for the way it infects cells in the body, which we'll talk about that later. And then it belongs to the family Mycobacterium, which is the same family as tuberculosis, and it is gram-positive. Okay, so fair warning, the next couple slides have some fairly graphic pictures, but leprosy is a pretty terrible disease, so that will be kind of displayed. Okay, so signs and symptoms. It's a pretty awful disease, right? So I think usually what we think about when we think about leprosy is the skin lesions, right? These sores on the body. There's a couple different types, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But yeah, pretty terrible skin lesions are painful oftentimes and can cause deformity. And then, right, so another part of this is deformity of the face. So you can see down here, right, part of this is the lesions. And then you can get, loss of the eyebrow, thickening of the facial, of the, skin on the face and the earlobes. And then you can also get destruction of facial tissue. And so here that's exemplified. You get destruction of the nasal septum, which is the part in between your nostrils, and that kind of causes the nose to collapse. And that's part of why we see like facial deformity in leprosy patients. And then, so the other really terrible part about leprosy is the nerve damage, and we'll talk about how it happens later. But basically, you're going to get peripheral nerve damage, which is anything other than the brain and spinal cord. And so, right, you can get loss of sensory function, loss of mobility, right? You can't move these joints as well, or you can't move them at all, and you can't feel things anymore because those nerves are damaged. And so because of this, you can actually, the body will sometimes reabsorb the digits or appendages, which is what you can see here, right? It looks like they've lost their fingers, and that's because basically the body is absorbing the tissues and cells back into circulation. I think that's because since you can't use them to sense things, and you can't use them for picking up objects and stuff like that, it's basically just dead tissue, and so your body just reabsorbs it, right? And then so you can also get this some thickening of the nerves, and that's due to bacteria infecting the nerves, right? And then the other thing that we should mention is that this can sometimes cause blindness. Right, you can get cataracts in the eyes, and then you can also get paralysis of the eyelids, and so you're unable to blink, and that's due to the nerve damage as well, right? And then also, you can just get blindness because your eyes are innervated, and so if those nerves are destroyed, then you'll go blind. Okay, so then the next thing we should talk about is this sort of spectrum of leprosy, and we go from tuberculoid to lepromatous leprosy. Basically, these are just classifications, right? It's the same disease, same bacteria that's causing it, but right, this is just sort of a way to classify the presentation, the amount of bacteria in the body, some of the detrimental effects, right? So with tuberculoid, you're going to have fewer skin lesions, you're going to have fewer bacteria in the body, and so usually I think people think of this as not as bad. The problem with tuberculoid is that you can get nerve damage quicker. So early on in the course of disease, you can get that nerve damage, as opposed to lepromatous. You can still get the nerve damage, but it just takes a lot. It takes a little bit longer for that to set in if you don't treat it, right? And then, so the other thing we should mention is there's two different types of reactions in terms of those skin lesions we were talking about. And so one of them is a reversal reaction that's going to happen in tuberculoid. You can see that here, right? So that's a edema or this irritation of a pre-existing lesion. And so, right, you can see that lesion sort of like spreads. It's a big on this guy's neck here. And then with lepromatous, you're going to get erythema nodosum leprosum, and or ENL. That's these small red painful bumps, sort of in between the existing lesions. And I think that's more characteristic. That's what we think of when we think of leprosy, is right this rash. There's these nodules or bumps on the skin. And then so you're going to have more bacteria in lepromatous. You're going to have widespread skin lesions. You're going to have a lot of them. And then so borderline is basically just in between tuberculoid and lepromatous. And there are many types of borderline. It goes from, right, so you have tuberculoid, and then you have borderline tuberculoid, mid-borderline, which is just right in the middle, and then you have borderline lepromatous and lepromatous. Right, so you're usually going to see ENL with most of the borderline types of leprosy. Okay, so something that's really interesting is how the bacteria actually infects the body. Right, so we talked about that it infects the nerves, and the reason it infects peripheral nerves is because the bacteria's optimal growth temperature is that of the nerves. So because your peripheral nerves are distal, right, they're further away from your core, further away from that core temperature, so it's a little bit cooler. And so inside of those nerves is really the optimal temperature for bacterial growth, for Mycobacterium leprae growth. And so the bacteria is going to infect the nerves. That's going to cause nerve damage. And then you're also getting CD8 positive cells killing the nerve because it's infected, right? And so obviously that's going to kill the nerves, and you're not going to be able to have sensory function and mobility. And the other thing is that leprosy will infect macrophages, which is really bad because this is supposed to be part of your immune system that is fighting the disease, right? But instead it becomes basically a host for the bacteria. And these cells, they think because it might have to do with the waxy coating, is why they're not broken down in the macrophage. But it's also somehow able to inhibit the fusion of the phagosome and the lysosome, right? So you can't form that phagolysosome, which we talked about when we were learning about immune system mechanisms, right? So you can't form that phagolysosome to break down the bacteria. And so, right, that's why it's sort of such a terrible, terrible disease. Okay, so then in terms of vaccines, medicine, immunity, right, it's really interesting. Actually, 95% of people have a natural immunity to leprosy. It's really actually pretty difficult to get because, first of all, most people have this natural immunity, and then the second thing is it's a slow-growing bacteria, and it's pretty hard to transmit it. They think that the mechanism by which people get it is someone sneezing or coughing who has it, and then you're inhaling those droplets with the bacteria in it. But usually you can't get it from one exposure. You're not going to get it if you're sitting next to somebody on the bus or whatever. Basically, you have to be maybe living with this person or just multiple exposures over a long period of time. And so there's a very effective multi-drug therapy, which consists of these drugs, which I'm not going to try to say because Dr. Cody will probably take off pronunciation points there. But this drug therapy is very effective. Usually you're cured. It takes 1 or 2 years, so it's a long time, but it is a very effective drug therapy. And then So in terms of a vaccine, I told you that it's in the same family as tuberculosis. And so what that means is the BCG vaccine, which was developed for tuberculosis, actually shows effectiveness in enhancing resistance to leprosy, right? So it's not a leprosy vaccine, it's a tuberculosis vaccine, but it does increase resistance to leprosy. Okay, and then, so the last thing we should talk about is the history. At least for me, I think of leprosy as a pretty ancient disease. I mean, it is a pretty ancient disease, right? I personally think of the Bible when I think of leprosy, right? It's mentioned in the Bible multiple times. And so, it's found in a lot of ancient writings, right? At least a mention of it, or something that sounds like leprosy is mentioned in a lot of ancient writings, different cultures. And so it's found in the Old Testament as the Hebrew word zarath, and then it's translated to Greek as lepa. And then in the New Testament, that's in the New Testament, and then it's translated into leprosy in our modern language. That's what we call it. There is some dispute as to whether this sort of leprosy of old, right, what we call leprosy is the same thing as what they called leprosy back then. Some people think it's just a name for any kind of rash or skin lesions, or they were just calling any kind of rash or skin lesion leprosy. So that's sort of a debate. There's a little passage here from Herodotus. Herodotus mentions it in his histories. So if any of you have taken West Civ, I know you guys have read the histories, you've read Herodotus. So that's pretty interesting. And then, so part of what historically made this disease so terrible was the social stigma, right, surrounding leprosy. And basically, you're seen as cursed by God. You've done something to offend God, right? That was just how it was viewed. So these people are viewed as, dirty, unclean, and they're sort of ousted from society, right? And this happens up through the Middle Ages, even later, where people are, forced to leave their families, forced to leave their occupations, forced to go live in a community of lepers, sort of away from society. And you can see down here, they're forced to carry around bells or clappers so that people know that they're coming and can get out of the way, right? And so pretty terrible social ramifications that go along with this, not to mention the terrible symptoms that we talked about. And so yeah, it's pretty extreme. People's belongings were taken and buried. I actually read that somewhere that they would say, in the Middle Ages, they would say masses for people when they contracted leprosy because they were considered dead to the rest of society. So pretty terrible social stigma surrounding it. And then last, you can get it from armadillos. Armadillos will carry it. So yeah, don't touch them, I guess. That's it. Thank you guys for listening.